Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Costume Society of America Conversations on Dress as seen at the Symposium. My name is Amidei. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a costume designer, a playwright, and the assistant professor of design at University of Wisconsin-Madison. My creative research focuses on designing for new works, costumes and gaming, immersive entertainment, and adaptive costuming for people with disabilities. I have the great pleasure to introduce Mona Jahani. Mona Jahani is now the assistant professor of costume design at Southeastern Louisiana University, where she teaches introduction to theater, costume design, and makeup design. She recently received her MFA in theater design from Michigan State University. Select costume designs for MSU include Bright Star, Monsieur Dion is a Woman, Wendy and the Neckbeards, and Julius Caesar. For her recent costume design for Monsieur Dion is a Woman, Mona was selected as a winner of the United States Institute for Theater Technology, USITT, Midwest 2022 Digital Design Competition. She also received an honorable mention in the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival, KCACTF Region 3, for theatrical design excellence in costume design. And she won the 2023 Howard Vincent Kurtz Emerging Theater Artist Award from the Costume Society of America. For today's webinar, we will start with Mona's wonderful presentation of her Kurtz Award-winning design shared at the 2023 National CSA Symposium in Salt Lake City. Following the presentation, we'll have time for further conversation with Mona and questions from myself and those in attendance. So please feel free to populate the chat with your questions at any time, and we will come back to those after the presentation. Then I will be giving you some more information on how you can nominate a student costume designer or maker for this year's Howard Vincent Kurtz Emerging Theater Artist Award. Now I want to hand it over to Mona.
Hello, thank you so much, Ali, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much for having me here. As I was introduced, my name is Mona Jahani, and I am a recent graduate of the Theater Design MFA program at Michigan State University. Since presenting this presentation at the Symposium in May, I am now the Assistant Professor of Costume Design at Southeastern Louisiana University. I'm so honored to be here today and to have been chosen for the Howard Vincent Kurtz Emerging Theater Artist Award. Today, I will talk a little bit about my process and the realized costume design for the play Monsieur Dion is a Woman by Mark Brownell. To start, I wanted to show a brief summary of the play and a blurb provided by the playwright. So, set in the 18th century France, Monsieur Dion Cordier is a soldier, spy, and intellect, keeps his or her secret for 60 years. A gender-bending, swashbuckling, biting comedy with all the right elements for an adventure story, it nonetheless makes some interesting observations about gender and class, both in 18th century France and today. This process, working on this play and on this design, really started with the director's vision that this play was not the true story of the title character Dion, and while inspired by true events, it exists entirely as fantastic fiction. His vision was to make a point of ridiculing the question that society within the world of the play is constantly asking Dion, are you a man or a woman? And it is with this question that my design set out to explore. In thinking about the world of the play, I started first by compiling historical references from the painted portraits and surviving garments, wanting to have a baseline understanding of the very broad silhouette and style trends of the eras roughly between 1736 and 1810, which is when Monsieur Dion was alive. Throughout the play, there are numerous references to well-known historical figures, and so it was crucial to find identifying elements for their characters as well, this being figures such as Marie Antoinette, Catherine the Great, and King George III. Having that root in some kind of historical reference was very important as a starting ground. However, the play contains this very comedic and fluid setting. And so from the very beginning, it was clear that the costumes were not meant to evoke literal realism or specific historical accuracy for all of the characters. And with that in mind, I turned my attention to additionally researching more modern interpretations of this era, both in fashion runway as well as streetwear, seeing how other designers in the more contemporary sphere have reinvented or reimagined certain historical elements. I chose to dress Dayon, the title character, in historically appropriate attire, both in men's and women's wear over the course of the play, effectively making them the only one wearing true clothing, while the ensemble was dressed in a much more stylized sense of costume. I set out to turn on its head the idea that a character who doesn't conform to society's expectations of gender had to be ahead of their time. By dressing Dayon historically, this contrasted with the ensemble, who wore a much more modern base with added garments on top. And so here I have the initial sketch for Dayon in a suit and then the finished rendering for that look. By dressing the ensemble in a much more caricaturized element of fashion divided by the historical binary, exaggerating elements of historical dress like padded hips or strong shoulders, I set out to visually depict the hypocrisy in how they treat Dayon throughout their life. A neutral and identical base costume brought the ensemble as a whole into a place outside of binary gender. This idea that despite holding Dayon to a dated societal standard of gender, the ensemble characters are the ones who seem visually unfinished or are out of place in this world. Here I've included a tableau of sketches for the ensemble throughout this design process, starting on the left with something more akin to a vaguely historically relevant base costume, and then later on adopting a modern jumpsuit with additional garments layered on top of that for various characters. Each actor in the ensemble played between 6 to 8 different distinct characters, and so this approach also helped me to lean into the very fast-paced nature of the French scenes of the play, while also still visually separating Dayon from the rest of society within the world of the play. For this production, I utilized my digital rendering technique to create a tableau for each of the French scenes, with every character present in each of those scenes as a tool to communicate with my director on what every beat and moment would look like from a costumes perspective before we got into the technical rehearsals and dress rehearsals for the play. Here we can see what that same scene ultimately ended up looking like on stage. This particular scene was set in the Russian court of Empress Elizabeth, during which she was holding a ball in which all of the guests were to dress as the opposite gender. This emphasis on gender expression really showed how the play was reliant on the costume design to depict the visual narrative thematically through the show. This is another moment from that scene. So the dancers here show how part of my communication with the director was regarding the gender breakdown of the actors themselves in the ensemble and how they would fit into the visual world of the design. Ultimately, we found it more compelling to the play's commentary on the hypocrisy and scrutiny of gender to have each actor in the ensemble play characters of both binary genders, relying entirely on the costume design to express the gender of each character that they played throughout the show. For Dayon's character, I worked pretty closely with the costume shop staff to build historically appropriate silhouettes in theatrical garments for this actor. It was crucial to the design for the audience to see Dayon as the only person wearing clothing while everyone else on stage lived in a much more artificial sense of costume. Not having the garments fit the actor would have undermined this vision. Seeing the ensemble characters as caricatures of the gender binary then further distinguished Dayon as the human focus of this theatrical narrative. And so here we see Dayon dressed as a woman in the French court scene towards the end of the play. They wear a complete dress appropriate for the era, while the characters in the ensemble are portraying female dancers. They only wear panniers with muslin overskirts. So this played into that previously discussed idea of the ensemble as unfinished exaggerations of gender expression. Here is another tableau for a series of battle scenes in the middle of the play, and Daon on the left is depicted in the uniform of a soldier in the dragoons, but other characters who are also fighting on Daon's side of the war are designed to wear uniforms that evoke a similar feeling with the red base and gold detailing, but they have much more modern details and still that sense of incompleteness to their total look. And here we can see how that scene ultimately ended up looking in the realized production. So Daon in the center in the dragoon uniform, and the others around Daon in that unfinished yet visually similar attire. One outlier character in the play is that of Joan of Arc. Her role as an inspirational and sort of guardian angel figure for Daon was one that I wanted to highlight in my design work. Daon sees themselves at various points in the play as a reincarnation of sorts of Joan of Arc. And so it was crucial to depict this character as outside of those ensemble conventions we've discussed. This actor was then the only ensemble member to fully change out of the jumpsuit base when playing this character, drawing on how real Joan of Arc's presence was in Daon's life as she continually appears in moments of great need. And so here, starting with the inspirational image, the rendering, and finally the realized image of her costume. And this is actually for the opening moments of the play. We can really see the contrast between Joan of Arc in a fully realized costume versus the ensemble members who are acting literally in their blocking as the framers of the action of the play. And so that role being very different between these characters. Another tableau here is one of the earlier scenes in the play for the French court of Louis XV, and then ultimately what that scene ended up looking like. Here especially, we can see how that pieced together nature of the ensemble characters adds to that comedic and caricature sort of feeling. The role of fashion and the consciousness about the gender of fashion is crucial to the plot of the play, and is crucial even within the narrative. So here at the top of Act 2, we start the second act of the play with a fashion show depicting the most extremes of modern style within the world of the play, and ultimately how that scene played out. However, there is this very show-stopping fashion garment within the fashion show, within the world of the play, that is meant to be inspired by Daon's character. So the half dress, half coat. But this garment is found unacceptable by King Louis XV, and so continually reinforcing the idea of what is socially acceptable as an expression of gender is constantly discussed within the play. So ultimately, Monsieur Daon as a woman proved to be a very excellent challenge in world building through the costume choices for a very heavily stylized design. Having those strong roots in the script and in historical fashion references felt very crucial in constructing an effective and ultimately compelling final design. And so that comes to the end of my presentation, and I look forward to any questions we may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Mona. That was amazing. And please put questions in the chat if you have any. And I will, in the meantime, I will ask you some of my own questions. First thing I wanted to ask you was, what was your experience at the symposium? Was that the first time you'd been to a Costume Society of America symposium? And what were
Yes,
some takeaways?
yes. So going to the symposium this past May, that was my first time attending. And so in some ways it was a little bit nerve-wracking to go, not only to attend for the first time, but also to be presenting and not really having an idea of what exactly the experience would be. But ultimately it was entirely positive. I felt so welcomed, and it was so lovely to get to meet so many people who have such shared interests and shared career paths. And so I found that people were very open to introducing themselves, to asking me about who I was and what I was doing, even before I gave my presentation. and afterwards coming up to me with questions, with praise, wanting to know a little bit more about my work. And so, in that sense, it was incredibly positive and a very useful experience. But also, I found that all of the sessions that I was able to attend were also really interesting to me and opened up to me, even though I did know a bit about the Costume Society of America and sort of the scope of what everyone's different roles or different areas of research may be. Getting to actually see those presentations was a lot of fun, and it was tough to pick between what concurrent sessions to attend or what
Mm.
might be. It was when everything is good, it's tough to know what to do. But that was a really good time, and it definitely motivated me to then want to attend again in the future and to see to follow up on that experience. So
Yeah,
definitely a
it's
good
such a
time.
different experience than attending USITT, where it's
Yes.
almost all theater industry focused. So being in a room with people who have the same overall interests in costumes and clothing, and then the different branches within that is really always really fascinating.
It's so
Um,
interesting to learn the things you don't know what you don't know until suddenly you know it.
exactly.
So it's great in that sense. Yes.
Here's a question from the attendees. Do you have any knowledge of how much of your divide between Dion's realism and the ensemble's unfinished nature uh, and the message you wanted to convey was obvious to the audience?
I think in some ways, having an understanding and being able to have seen the performance, I feel that the divide was pretty clear, that a person did not necessarily have to have a lot of strict historical reference in their own personal experience to get the sense that there was some kind of divide. And that was something that I was trying to be considerate of as I was going through the design process. Part of that with the ensemble being in a base costume that was apparent.
Mhm.
Sometimes a character would be on stage for just a moment and then run into the wings or into the voms and change very quickly and come back out. And there was this sort of expectation and understanding that we weren't trying to trick the audience with the ensemble members to completely hide their identity as to give the impression that the cast was full of hundreds of people. There was a sense of being able to see the through line that kind of added to that comedic element. And so I think they could see that um, the conventions we were trying to set with the ensemble had a very big difference between this one character who's really pushing the story and we're trying to root for them. And in the way that they're dressed, that kind of they might not needed to know exactly what painting it was referencing or what garment we were trying to replicate, but that there was still something about that divide that for most people I think did read to some degree, even if they had more questions about it than answers, that there was something for them to chew on.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's establishing a world, basically world building, which
Absolutely.
ties into our next question, which is what are your suggestions for starting to world build and making it seem realistic and idealistic at the same time?
It's tough to know because so many things are dependent on the variables of the show, what the other designs are doing.
Mhm.
But as simple as it may sound, and it's something that I talk about with my intro students, is sometimes leaning on just those basic elements and principles of design can spark a convention or a rule that you within the production team are adhering to on your own. In this case, I think it fell pretty heavily on the idea of silhouette and shape and form, but for something else that it might be more that principle of unity or balance or repetition, whatever um, foundational building blocks can make sense in the world of the play. All of those details can follow after, but it is tough, especially in this case. There was always the worry that is the ensemble a little bit too, is it too comedic? Is it too caricaturized? Are we losing some of those historical references? But then knowing that because the dialogue within the play itself is so referential, um, we don't have to necessarily rely on as many minute details to
Mhm.
get something across. So that might be a balance that won't work for another project or production. But being able to be in touch with the text and knowing what can you count on, or other design elements, what can you, uh, who is leaning the most in one particular way is helpful in some sense.
Right. Thinking, talking more about the text and literature and research, um, what was there any literature that played a key role when you researched the costume design for this production? What about reading material you can recommend for historical gender bending that you found?
Right. In this sense, I think my research process and sort of my folder of information that I was constantly referring back to, it ranged a lot in what sources I was drawing on, but a lot of them were much more visual than they were literary or
Mhm.
textual. I did with the consciousness that with surviving garments or with paintings, there is a bias to what is being depicted from a particular era of history and what may not be as fleshed out, still wanting to have sort of that visual library that I could, for a lot of those ensemble characters, I'm not necessarily trying to recreate a historical garment, but I'm trying to zoom out a bit and scroll through very quickly and see what catches my eye, what is repetitive in a lot of these images, what is perhaps a style trend that I want to utilize. But in terms of specific literary text, I don't have one single source that really kind of guided more than anything else did. I did try to be as well read as I could be, going through different fashion history texts, costume history surveys, and things of that sort.
Yeah, I'm interested in reading this script because I'm about to work on Orlando next semester, which is another gender bending um, tale. It also goes throughout time, though, too, as an added complication. So that'll be interesting. We can compare notes at the next
Would love
symposium.
to.
Maybe do a collaboration on a paper or something. Um, I was going to ask you about your transition from being a graduate student to a student designer to now assistant professor and a professional designer. I mean, in the course of a few short months now, you're
Yes,
a grown up officially. If I can,
officially.
yeah. Although I don't feel like a grown up myself. But yes,
I
how's that
think
transition been for you?
well, that's good to hear because it's interesting in so many ways. In some sense, it feels like so little has changed given the rigor of grad school. It feels some days that the only thing I've stopped doing is being a student, but that everything else is just more all the time. Um, Being fortunate that I was to get a lot of teaching experience in grad school, and now primarily my role being as an educator and a teacher, doing all of that class prep for the first time, trying to make sure that all of the lessons are planned and ready to go, that the materials, that all of the assignments have examples, things of that nature. Things like that do take are different than the workload that I had in grad school, but in some ways it's still that balance of trying to balance the teaching aspect, the mentoring aspect, that more educational role for the students, as well as then design work and shop work. In my case, I am my own costume shop manager at my university. And so, not just coming up with what is the design for the next project, but how am I going to break down the build schedule? What tasks do I want to give my student workers? What projects do I want to assign to who to make sure that we are all learning and growing in our hand sewing and machine sewing and patterning? So being able to balance those things, I feel that grad school gave me a very good foundation for that, and being able to be multi-talented or flexible in not letting one thing drop. But it is definitely different than the student experience, and being on the other side of it is very fun and very interesting, but definitely teaches you more every day uh, than you could have ever known. So it's one of those you don't know what you don't know
Yeah,
until now
exactly.
you have to know it. But I've loved it,
You
and
have to pretend like you know it now. Although I often admit I don't know things, and I think that's a good thing to model for students, right? Is that what I don't know is vast.
being able to know what you don't know, or finding
Yes.
that, well, how am I going to find out, is a skill in and of itself. Being able to ask for help in a constructive way um, is something that I think we do not just when it is your first semester of teaching.
Yeah, Karen would like to know what if your thoughts about mentorship. What's your approach to mentorships? What methods do you find most beneficial when you were being mentored, and now that you're applying to your mentorship of young designers?
Well, that is great, being that Karen was my mentor. But
So you better
um,
say nice things right now, right?
yes, I find that, especially now that I am in a different sort of mentorship role than I was before as a graduate student, trying to find what is the language that speaks to the student as opposed to being as rigid in the follow my example method is pretty useful. So the idea that I can still teach the same information, but it might be that my two student workers in the costume shop are starting at very different experience levels. I can see what speaks to them, find who is more the visual learner, who needs those written instructions, who wants to practice while I do, and who wants to watch me do the entirety of a step before they take that on. I think in that sense, it might be pretty straightforward or basic. The idea of trying to figure out what is the communication style that's going to work best for each student, but not assuming that that student knows what their preferred communication style is either. I think sometimes being able to ask those questions in less direct ways or trying to glean that information in more informal, observational ways kind of helps to reduce some pressure. The feeling that if I, as the student, don't know how to ask for that help, that clearly this is a wash, I'm a lost cause, I can't quite overcome that obstacle when they just might not know the the way that they need to be instructed. So I find that a little bit of that roundabout approach is a little bit more useful, but still trying to be flexible, knowing that the benchmarks that we're trying to reach or the foundational skills that we're trying to learn are much more important than the approach by which to learn them. So it's a little bit of an everything.
We have a question about research. If you were going to recommend how to for your students to start researching a time period such as Regency or Victorian, where do you send them
Mm-hmm.
when they're just starting out? Where do you try to send them away from, or do you
Yes.
try to, what is your approach to helping them get started in research?
Yes. So I find that it makes a little bit of a difference knowing what era we're going for, with the idea that is this really before or after the popularity of photography? Because I think that does change the answer a bit. But if the answer is sooner or earlier than when most photography would be available, starting with not Pinterest. Not that I don't utilize that resource, and I do find it really useful, much more for the inspirational, the color, the textural sort of things. I think that it can be tough sometimes to not gravitate to an image that is visually compelling, but not being able to verify the source of that image is sometimes one little step too many to then say, but I really liked this one and I want it to fit what I want it to be. And that's a little bit of a tough hurdle because of the convenience. And it's not that a convenient tool is a bad one, that we have to work in ineffective ways necessarily. But I think I would save that for a different part of the research process. And instead, um, when you're first starting, it doesn't necessarily have to be the deepest deep dive of sources. It might be to look at a survey of historic costume and see what are those first few images and references, what are the descriptions of what those garments are, and using those to then help when trying to identify, is this actually labeled correctly? Does this seem like it is approximately correct? Helping to verify and vet that information in a way. I find that if it's an era of historical costume in which we do have surviving garments or that online museum resources may be helpful, those are not going to paint a full picture of the era, but that there's still somewhere to start to see if an image is perhaps cross-listed or referenced in another gallery or another collection that might have additional um, bibliography resources that would be useful to pursue. And so I think that's where I would start, and I would first send a student. And to make it clear that that online Google search or that Pinterest search is not necessarily a never approach, but that we want to start with things that we can know for sure, and then branch up from there.
Yeah, that's good. I often say the same. I'm like, don't do what I do is what I often start with. But I'll show them often like here's like until you can start to discern the differences between um uh even just like the a between AI images and actual research. I mean, like
that is a really tough hurdle to sort of
yeah, and it's just, you
overcome
have
right
to
now.
build up that visual Rolodex, which they don't even know what a Rolodex is anymore. So then I have to, you know what a Rolodex is? I don't know. So yeah, like so I just try to teach them how to just start building up that information so that they can be discerning and making sure they're getting reliable images before they start just Pinterest diving. Plus, it's a wormhole like of distractions as well.
There's
So
just so many things to dive into there.
yeah, yes. I was just asking about your design practice. Like, what are some of the priorities that are important to you when you're approaching a show, when you're working as a collaborative artist with a design team? What is important for you?
Definitely. I think I'm one of those designers that really likes to be able to have my own time with the script first before I hear from anyone, including the director. Not because I don't want to hear their vision quite yet, but I think that my personal approach to reading, rereading, taking those notes, finding what stands out the most to me, what questions I might have. It might be just particular languages or lines of those dialogue. Those are things that I want to be able to hold on to first, knowing that I don't have necessarily one exact process that I like to keep with directors. I'm pretty flexible to the type that have a really specific vision and want me as the designer to coordinate it versus those that might not, they might come to that first meeting and to say, what does everyone else think? And let's come up with it together. I always want to have some kind of route to bring myself back to. So that way I don't feel as concerned going into those deep dives or those rabbit holes or those tangents upon tangents, because sometimes very interesting design concepts or questions might come up, even if they aren't right for this show, they could be for something else. Not wanting to feel constrained by getting away from the heart of the show, giving myself something to come back to is pretty useful. And in a similar sense, I then really like to see from directors one central something at least. It could be a particular painting, a visual imagery, a feeling, a quote, anything that they feel the most drawn to, even if we as the group may end up shifting bit by bit throughout that process. Knowing what was interesting or exciting at first helps to bring that back. And especially when working in theater with other collaborative areas that are so at times different from our own, being able to say, what is your connection back to this theme? What is my connection back to this theme? What is everyone's something that brings us back to that central question or that initial vision? I find pretty useful, but everything that's in the in between feels very flexible to me. The rounds of research or sketching or breakout meetings kind of is all dependent, but the things that I'd like to have constant throughout would probably be those central tenets.
Do you have dream projects, like things that you haven't been able to do yet, or things that you want, like I can't wait to do this weird script, or
I'm
mm.
a very big Sarah Rule fan, and so
Oh
I've
yeah.
always really wanted to do Eurydice. It's something that I've done a paper project for multiple times, but it just never quite seems to be the realized project that happens. So I think even though it's maybe not the most costume complex or grand sort of play, it's one that I feel like I would want to dive into the character and do a lot of that character detail and design work that I think would be really interesting. So that's always been my go-to answer, and so far I have not had the chance yet.
What what do you where do you think things are going in the field, and or what do you want to see happen that isn't currently happening?
I think there's so much happening depending on where you are in your career and where you are geographically in the costume design world. I think that, or I'd like to hope that as a whole, we're moving towards better practices bit by bit, whether that's in educational theater, trying to evaluate those questions of what do our students need to be successful? What does the emerging professional need? What can we do to like equalize the student experience depending on where you're coming from going into college can be full of such disparity. But it seems like that impossible question. There's no one size fits all sort of answer. But similarly, I think in the world professionally for design or costumes as the whole, not even necessarily as a designer, there are so many intentional efforts towards better practices, whether that's in wage disparity or hours, skills, benefits, accessibility, that I think there is a lot of really positive work being done in that way, but that there are still inevitably those pitfalls, that summer stock gig that is barely paying minimum wage, or the schedule that seems that might have better resources, but that is demanding really long hours or not really following those break schedules. There's some things still that are being talked about and being worked on, but that it's tough to sort of create that new standard when there's still a feeling, I think, from younger artists and designers that they have to get their first something, they have to do that first gig to get something that's better, even if they know that that the benefits, that the pay, that the hours are not what they should be. It's tough to kind of eliminate that fear of, but if no one else is going to take it, then I should take it because it's at least something to do. So I think on the whole, we're working as a community and as a profession towards those better practices. I think a lot of people are working really hard to push for that, but that it's still tough in those ways, especially for younger artists.
Well, thank you. Those were great answers, and I feel very hopeful. I asked that question knowing that some people like get very kind of down and depressed about the state of the industry and the state of the field, and it's very refreshing to hear hope and active plans in place that you have to improve things and to pass that on to your students who are going to be working in the field as well. So that is really great. I wanted to share with everyone the information about the award. Okay, so the Howard Vincent Kurtz Emerging Theater Artist Award recognizes student members and seeks to foster their development. It's given annually and provides financial assistance to student who has been selected to present a brief overview of their research or creative work at the CSA National Symposium. Students receive a $500 travel stipend and a registration fee for the day of their presentation. They also get a 2-year membership to CSA. And this is funded through the CSA endowment, and the award is intended to encourage student participation in both the symposium and CSA. This award was established in 2021 and is named for its contributor, Howard Vincent Kurtz, who has had a diverse career as a costume designer, an educator of theater costume design, and a costume curator. He's a professional costume designer who is a member of the United Scenic Artists Local 829, and Howard is a pattern maker and a draper of costumes on Broadway, Hollywood films, and television. He is a professor emeritus of theater at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, where Howard served as the resident costume designer and head of the design tech program. During that time, Professor Kurtz was also an associate curator of costumes and textiles at the Hillwood Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. He's also a fellow of the Costume Society and served on its board of directors, chair of endowment, treasurer, and as treasurer and president of the Mid-Atlantic region. He continues to lecture on a wide range of costume history topics for various organizations. There's a QR code here if you want to get information for the award. This year, there's been a change in the way that people can apply. This year, we've changed it to be the emerging theater artists must be nominated by a current CSA member. So then the CSA member will be submitting that application on behalf of the student if the student is not already a CSA member. This kind of eliminates the obstacle to some students to already be a registered CSA member. That might be a financial obstacle. So this is making it more accessible for more students. And then you as faculty and staff at universities can then, encourage your students to create this application and you can submit it for them. So other eligibility requirements, the nominated emerging artist must be a current undergraduate or graduate student. And then the creative work that they're submitting must have be completed or in process prior to the deadline of December 15th. And so to apply, they need to create a PDF document under 100 megabytes, and it's submitted through an online form. It requires a cover page with the contact information, an abstract of no more than 350 words about their work and the creative challenges, 8 labeled images giving an overview of the work, and an additional 4 images may be submitted, a current 2-page resume, and then 2 letters of recommendation from faculty, advisors, or mentors in the student's academic program and or the professional arena. So faculty members could be a design instructor, a supervisor in the shop or studio, a history professor, or department chair. And so if you have questions about this, please email me at aramidei@wisc.edu. The deadline is December 15th, and you'll be notified by the end of January. Then the award winner will get a discount code for day of registration fee, and they'll give a research presentation of their award-winning design, like the one you just saw, at the National Symposium. They'll also get a reimbursement for travel expenses. Okay, and so last thing I wanted to share with you, I would hope that you would also consider making a donation to the Costume Society of America to help support the CSA's mission and wonderful programming like this. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Mona, for your presentation. And please, everyone, spread the word about this award and nominate your theater student designers and makers for this award. Thank you.